those of you in the United States, Canada, you've already had yours, so this didn't. You don't count this time. Only kidding. But for those of you who are celebrating Thanksgiving in the United States, there's always a rather interesting thing, a sort of fan favorite for a long time. There's a selection from the late Rush Limbaugh in one of his books, The Way Things Ought to Be. One of the stories that, the true story of Thanksgiving, what the history books never told you. I suppose I could read. I suppose I could read this myself. There's a version that American school children are usually taught that the Pilgrims arrived in the New World after an arduous trip across the Atlantic Ocean. They didn't know why they were there. They had no idea what to do. They had nothing. The Indians took pity on them and saved them and taught them how to do things they did not know how to do, like grow food and catch beavers and etc. And basically, the Indians saved them, and the Pilgrims thanked them by growing a whole bunch of food and having this big feast. The story of Thanksgiving that's taught is basically how, without the Native Americans, there would not be a country because the Pilgrims would have died. And at least the Pilgrims were nice enough to pay the Indians back with a big Thanksgiving dinner. And that is actually not at all what happened. Not even close. The real story of Thanksgiving, going back to the very first early days of the Pilgrims arriving at Plymouth Rock, is that socialism is a failure. And that's crucially important today because, you know, we've just had a defeat of one particular political party that is hell-bent on the implementation of socialism. Samuel, thank you so much for the follow. But the story of the Pilgrims begins in the early part of the 17th century. The Church of England under King James I was persecuting anyone and everyone who did not recognize the Church's absolute civil and spiritual authority, which was the state. Those who challenged the ecclesiastical authority and those who believed strongly in freedom of worship were hunted down. This was England back in the 1600s. They were hunted down and imprisoned, sometimes executed for their beliefs. There were a group of separatists, of people who didn't want any part of this. They first fled to Holland, they like the wooden shoes and cheese over there, and established a community. And they stayed there for about 11 years. After those 11 years, about 40 of these same separatists, who rather liked the wooden shoes and cheese, agreed to make a perilous journey to the New World. And they knew they would face hardships like you and I absolutely do not know. We cannot know the level of hardship these people had to endure. I mean, try to explain something like flight or jet travel and they wouldn't understand it. But they knew they would face hardships, but of paramount importance to them was living freely and worshipping God according to the dictates of their own consciences, their own beliefs. And that's what they believed they were denied the freedom to do in England. So on August 1st, 1620, the Mayflower set sail carrying a total of 102 passengers, including 40 of these separatists, the Pilgrims. There were just 40 of them. They were led by William Bradford, and on the journey across the Atlantic, well, Bradford set up an agreement, a contract, if you will, and it established just and equal laws for all 40 members of the Pilgrim community, irrespective of their religious beliefs. It did not matter what their religious beliefs were. These are the laws they were all agreeing to live by. What we're talking about is the Mayflower Compact. It was derived from the Bible. The Pilgrims were a people completely steeped in the lessons of the Old and New Testaments. They were devoutly religious. No matter what else was said about them, and even that is denied, they were devoutly religious. They looked to the ancient Israelites for that example, and because of the biblical precedent set forth in Scripture, they never doubted that their experiment would work. Went from Jaguar to Thanksgiving law. Yes. These pilgrims never doubted they would get to the New World. They never doubted that once they got there, they would thrive. The journey was long, arduous, dangerous. And when they finally landed, when the pilgrims finally landed in New England in November, according to William Bradford's detailed journal, they found a cold, barren, desolate wilderness. Imagine New England, as it exists today, as nothing but rocks, forest, undeveloped nature in November, and only getting colder. They had no friends to greet them. There was no shelter of any kind, other than hiding under a tree. It was desolate. No hotels, no inns, no places to clean up, no houses. There was no traces of civilization out there whatsoever. It was wild country. The sacrifice they had made for the freedom to worship was only just beginning. During that first winter, half of them, including William Bradford's own wife, died of starvation, sickness, and exposure to the elements. And now we're getting close to what people are taught in public schools. When spring finally came, by the way, writing that just does not do it justice, spring did not just finally come, it was a matter of survival, an act of survival that we in the modern era cannot possibly relate to or understand. Perhaps military special forces can, those who have been trained to understand what the Pilgrims went through, but you and I, civilians, cannot. We've never done anything like that. First winter in the New World. But they survived, and spring finally came. They did meet the Indians, the Native Americans, who were there, who did help them in planting corn and fishing for cod. They showed them where the beavers were, so the beavers could be skinned for coats and other things. But even at this, even with this degree of assistance from the Indians, the Native Americans, there was not any prosperity yet. They had the Mayflower Compact, they had these laws they were living by, and yet there was no prosperity. And this is important to understand, because this is where modern American history lessons end, with the Indians teaching the Pilgrims how to eat, how to fish, how to skin beavers, all of that. That's where it ends. That's the feel-good story, but it doesn't even get close to the true story. Thanksgiving is actually explained in some textbooks as a holiday for which the Pilgrims give thanks to the Indians for saving their lives, but it was not that at all. That happened, but Thanksgiving was the devout expression of gratitude by the Pilgrims to God for their survival and everything that was a part of it. I mean, just thinking of the day-to-day life, any era without modern plumbing would suck. Yes. In the New World, you had to dig a hole. Now here's the part that's been omitted. The original contract the Pilgrims entered into in Holland, they had sponsors. They did not have the money to do this trip on their own, they had sponsors. These were merchant sponsors in London and Holland. These merchant sponsors demanded everything that the Pilgrims produced in the New World would go to a common store, a single bank, if you will. And each member of the Pilgrim community was entitled to one share. So, everyone had an equal share of whatever was in that bank. All of the land they cleared, all of the houses they built belonged to that bank, and to the community as well. And they were going to distribute it equally. because they were going to be fair to one another. So all of the land that they cleared, all of the houses they built, belonged to everyone. They belonged to the community, they belonged to the bank, they belonged to the common store. No one owned anything, they just had an equal share in it. It was a commune. Reminds me of Shogun. Speaking of, have you seen it yet? Not yet. Not yet. I do want to see it. Haven't seen it yet. Forerunner of the communes that we saw in the 60s and 70s out in California, we had it here with the Pilgrims in the New World. They even had their own organic vegetables. I mean, what else could there be? There's no such thing as processed anything back then. Now, William Bradford, who had become the governor of the colony because he was the leader, recognized this was not going to work. It was costly, destructive. It just wasn't working. It was a collectivist society. It was socialism, and it was failing. That first winter had taken a lot of lives. The manpower was greatly reduced. So, William Bradford decided to take bold action. He assigned a plot of land to each family. They would work it, manage it however they wanted to. If they wanted to sit on it, get fat, dumb, happy, and lazy, they could. If they wanted to develop it, if they wanted to grow corn or whatever, they could. If they wanted to build on it, they could do that. If they wanted to turn it into some sort of quasi-business, they could do whatever they wanted with it. He turned loose the power of the capitalist marketplace long before Karl Marx was even born. The Pilgrims had discovered and experimented with what could only be described as socialism, and they discovered, surprise, surprise, it did not work. Hopefully no one tried to focus on watercress. It wasn't called that then, though, socialism, but that's exactly what it was. Everyone was given an equal share. From each according to his ability to each according to its need. And you know what happened? Nobody did a bloody thing. There was no incentive. Nothing worked. Nothing happened. What Bradford and his community found was the most creative and industrious people had no incentive to work any harder than anyone else, unless they could utilize the power of personal motivation. But while most of the rest of the world had been experimenting with socialism for well over 100 years, trying to refine it, perfect it, reinvent it, the Pilgrims decided early on to scrap it permanently. What Bradford wrote about this social experiment should be in every schoolchild's history lesson, and if it were, we might prevent much needless suffering, if the true story of Thanksgiving had been taught for years and years and years. For the young men that were most able and fit for labor and service, they sat around and did nothing. They would spend their time and strength to work for other men's wives and children without being paid for it. And why should they do that? They didn't. That was thought injustice. Why should you work for other people when you can't even work for yourself? What's the point? The Pilgrims found people could not be expected to do their best work without incentive. They harnessed the power of good old free enterprise by invoking capitalism, the principle of private property, all the way back in the 1600s. And the results were incredible. Every family assigned its own plot of land. They could do with it whatever they wanted to. Bradford wrote this had very good success, but it made all hands industrious, so as much more corn was planted than otherwise would have been. So when the profit motive was introduced, when the opportunity to prosper was introduced, it went gangbusters. And that is the essence of the true story of Thanksgiving. They set up trading posts and exchanged goods with the Indians after they had enjoyed this prosperity. It was not the Indians that brought in the prosperity. That's not said to insult anyone, just a statement of fact. The Indians did assist in their arrival, undeniably, but what led to prosperity for these original settlers was the common store failed. It was only when they introduced what turns out to be capitalism, where you keep what you produce and sell what you don't need, that things went crazy. It was not something they were taught by anyone by self-experience. It was not the Indians who taught this. None of this is said to put anybody down. The Indians did a lot of things that helped them, but it was their own industriousness that saved the Pilgrims. They set up trading posts and exchanged goods with the Indians. They sold stuff to them. Those profits allowed them to pay off their debts to the merchants, including their sponsors in London and Holland. And you know what? The success of that colony after they abandoned socialism and tried what was essentially capitalism, word spread throughout the old world this massive amount of prosperity that was there for the taking in the New World. And thus the New World was flooded with new arrivals. The success and prosperity of the Plymouth settlement attracted more Europeans and began what came to be known as the Great Puritan Migration. And all it took was prosperity and word spreading across the Atlantic of how there was prosperity and it was there for the taking. All you had to do was get there and give it a shot. The lesson, the true story of Thanksgiving, is that William Bradford and his Pilgrim community were thanking God for the blessings on their community after the first miserable winter of a documented failure brought on by their attempt at fairness and equality, which was socialism. Only when they abandoned it did it work. The Native Americans, the indigenous people, the Indians, whatever you want to call them, they were of considerable assistance. They were friendly when the Pilgrims arrived, but they had little, if anything, to do with the prosperity that occurred. That was the result of Bradford and Pilgrim leadership deciding to change their structure, the Mayflower Compact. The Indians did assist, naturally. That's undeniable. They taught them how to fish. That's the kind of thing they didn't know how to do. That led them to be productive. That is undeniable. But it was the Pilgrim community itself which experienced such massive prosperity. Once more, capitalism proves to be a fantastic motivator indeed. Now, some of you may have heard of the Native American by the name of Squanto. During the winter of 1620, an Indian named Squanto came to their rescue. He was no ordinary native. Early settlers in 1610 had captured him, sold him into slavery. A group of Catholic friars freed him, brought him to England, where he learned to speak English. In 1618, serving as an interpreter on an English ship, he was brought back to the New World. It was Squanto, the famous Native American in his own right in the Pilgrim story, who taught the Pilgrims how to plant and fish, how to skin beavers. It was Squanto who brokered a peace treaty between the Pilgrims and other Indian tribes. And there was more than one tribe of Indians that was not copacetic. It was not friendly and at one with nature. It was not anything like the multiculturalists would have you believe. There were squabbles, there were power struggles, turf battles. It was human, an indelibly human affair. The Indians, the Pilgrims, everybody was scrambling for power, for survival. Survivability was the name of the game, and it was not a guarantee. Many of the Pilgrims literally believed God had sent Squanto to save them, and the Pilgrims believed, that without Squanto they would never have survived or thrived. And they experienced a tremendous harvest in 1621, and that is the big gathering that is taught in the history books. The native Indians and the Pilgrims joined together for a huge feast, which is the foundational story of the Thanksgiving story that is taught in public schools in America. But again, that is not the real story of Thanksgiving. That is the textbook brand. It did happen, but there's so much more to it than that. One of the most important legacies of early settlers is that they experimented with socialism in the 1620s and it did not work. Private property rights and personal responsibility, two pillars of a free market economy, saved the Plymouth colony from extinction and laid the economic foundation for a free and prosperous nation that we all enjoy today. That is the true story of Thanksgiving. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. Subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon so you never miss an update. If you have any thoughts, questions, or ideas for future videos, drop them in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. You can also follow me on Twitter @LordRexworth for more updates and behind-the-scenes content. And if you want to support the channel, check out my Ko-fi or Throne pages. Links are in the description. Finally, be sure to visit LordRexworth.com and follow me across all platforms. That's LordRexworth.com. Until next time, I wish you all the best, and God bless.